The way we take care of ourselves is ever evolving. And what we know for sure is that our mind and spirit are linked to our physical body, and that our wellness seems to extend into our communities and the planet we all share. It is very, very clear that wellness is interconnected. We love spending time with you to explore and practice the breakthroughs, the insights, and the passions of incredible people helping us all see the world in a whole new light. This is Health Gig. We are especially excited today to welcome to Health Gig a TV journalist and a filmmaker who is also a very good friend, Jane Skinner. I've known our guest for a very long time, someone I love and admire and who's doing great things in the world. Our families are friends and our dads work together, so we have many, many connections. And so, Jane, welcome to Health Gig.
Thank you so much for being here. And I always tell people, Doro, that you did the nicest thing that anyone probably has ever done for me when I was a young cub reporter moving at 23 years old to Portland, Maine, to a new TV market I knew nobody. And you were just moving away from Portland, but you said, let me give you all my friends.
Oh, yeah.
And the moment I got there, I got phone calls and letters and invitations to come to dinners and not feel lonely as a young person there. And it was the most beautiful gesture. And of course, Doro has the nicest friends. So.
Oh, well, that's so nice. And you're still friends with some of them, or most of them, right?
I am. I'm so lucky.
Which is so nice. So I know all about you, and Tricia knows about you because I've told her all about you.
Because she's told me about you. And you're amazing.
The good and the bad, right?
No bad.
All good. All good.
Yes. So, but we want our listeners to know about you. So tell us about you and how and where you grew up and how you decided to become a journalist.
Sure. I grew up just north of Chicago. I'm definitely a Chicago lover. Somebody asked me just last night, if you could move back to Chicago, I say, yep. Tomorrow. So I loved it very much. I happened to have grown up in the shadow of Hallis Hall, which is where the Bears practiced and continue to. Back in those days, it was actually on a college campus, Lake Forest College, so we could walk. That's what my mom would say, take the kids on Saturday mornings, and my dad would take my older brothers and I over to watch the Bears practice. It was open. It was kind of like walking onto like a high school football field. There was no security and that kind of stuff. So it was a very, very fun place to grow up.
So you loved football from like a long time ago, right?
There was no choice in our family. I'm the youngest, and I have two older brothers, and my dad got season tickets to the Bears, which he still has today, in 1972. You know, and I look back on it now, and it's funny. I didn't think about it at the time. I was just trying to keep up with the boys and have a blast with them and fit in, so I had good football knowledge. But I think about it today, and, you know, it must have been kind of funny. Like, there were not a lot of little girls in Soldier Field, right? Back in the 70s. But you look around today, and my husband and I have twin daughters who are now in their 20s, and you go to a football stadium, and it's packed with women. So, I mean, we were at a game, and we loved with them particularly to, you know, not to go sit in a suite, but to go sit in the stands, because it's kind of how we all grew up and love it the most. And we're all football junkies. So people actually watch when you sit in the stands, as opposed to chatty. That just makes me sound like spoiled that I don't want to sit in a suite, but it's much more fun to get a beer down in the stands. But we were at a game in Minneapolis last season. Maybe it was the season before, but it was a Monday night game, and there were women there on girls' night out, right? And that is just something that it didn't really hit me until that moment. I thought, oh, I would have loved to have done that, you know, back when I was their age. But it's really changed a lot, and it's really been a fun thing to watch.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess now's a good time, Doro, to ask about, you know, Taylor
Swift already?
Speaking of girls in the audience.
Speaking about girls and what's happening.
We'll just knock that out at the beginning. But yeah, how exciting was that to have Taylor Swift?
So fun. And it was just came so out of the blue and so organically, which was, I don't know, I'm a journalist. I'm always cynical and things are set up and PR people and all that kind of stuff. But it really just happened. And it just unfolded in such a fun way. I do think she naturally has the most positive vibe anyway. And to have her bring that, you know, unabashed enthusiasm to a game was so fun to watch. And, you know, even over the past several years, the league always looks at their audience numbers and research by, you know, gender, ethnicity, or age, everything. Their numbers have always told them that about 45% of their audience and fans are women. It doesn't surprise me because I grew up in a house with my mother was a crazy fan. She's still actually our craziest Bears fan. She won't even go to a Super Bowl party because she wants to watch the game. I kind of knew that, but just to watch that number even expand this year, it's really fun. Football, I think it's kind of a complicated game, right? It's not super easy to learn. It's, some people call it like a chess game on a field. So I think the fact that she opened it up for people who might have felt intimidated by that, I thought it was the most amazing thing to watch. Plus, she's just so happy and joyful. Who doesn't want to watch her rocking out in the stands?
What did it do to the numbers? Is it surpassed 50%?
It's really hard. I don't know that they've done them for this year, but it's hard to tease out, right?
Right.
You have fantastic games, a great season, a terribly exciting Super Bowl. Those numbers are going to be really high anyway. And I don't know that they can pick out, did you come to watch because you like Taylor Swift? But was there an effect? I can't imagine there wasn't, right? There has to have been.
Amazing.
So it's fun.
So we love Taylor Swift, but we need to take a few steps back because you were a journalist for 20 years and you were an on-air journalist. So talk about that. Tell us what that was like.
So I grew up in this very sports-heavy family, obviously, but my family is really full of lawyers. And in college, I really planned to do that too. I didn't really know what else to think about. And then I watched my older brothers go through law school, and they just had so much stuff to read, and it just seemed like, oh, that is not where my skills lie. I was a good student, but I didn't love the idea of piles and piles and piles of paper and sitting in an office. That just wasn't for me so much. And my dad had been involved in Chicago politics my entire life. He, my senior year of college, went to work for Doro's dad, the luckiest moment, he always says, of his life when he was able to work for his administration. As I was graduating from college, he was just arriving in Washington, and he was saying to me, basically, I'm going to go work for the government and not make any money, and you have to go get a job, figure it out. So none of this, I want to go travel in Europe thing.
Right.
It just kind of hit me, even on the rides down in the back of a station wagon rolling around to Soldier Field, we always had the CBS radio news on. When I hear the chimes for, still today, they still use some of those same, sounds. It just reminds me of that. And I thought, well, that's the perfect mix for me, because our dinner table conversations growing up were not how is your math test so much as they were, did you see the governor's new law that he signed, something he's just signed into law. We really had, my dad and my mom are both very bright, and they really, insisted in the nicest way that we be aware of what was going on in our surroundings. He worked for the government a lot over his career, and public service was very important to him. So it just kind of made sense that it might be fun to marry some things, my love of information, news. And I always, always, always loved broadcast. I thought maybe I'll be a producer of TV commercials or something, but it really needed to be deeper than that, I felt like. So anyhow, I ended up becoming a reporter and anchor for 20 years. I did a very classic pattern where my first job was for $12,000 in Duluth, Minnesota. That's not true. Actually, they offered me 12, and I said, I'll come for 13.
And then you went in the middle.
Yeah, that was my first negotiating. And then I went to Portland, Maine, which is where I met all Doro's great friends, St. Louis, Milwaukee. And then I ended up meeting my husband, Roger Goodell, who, in case people don't know, is the NFL commissioner. So that's kind of where the fun NFL tie comes in. He was working in New York. I was working in Milwaukee. I really, really wanted to get back to Chicago, but I got married to him and ended up in New York.
How
and
did
I worked
you meet him?
For Fox. We met at a wedding. So my next door neighbor growing up just north of Chicago was set up on a long distance blind date with Roger's good friend who grew up in Manhattan. And they have very different personalities, and they got married very quickly. So we all thought, what is this? This is never going to last. They've been married 30 years. They are so happy, and a fun mix. And we met at their wedding, and then it took a little while. I have to be honest, I was still on my career path, wanting to get back to Chicago. I didn't really have an interest in moving to New York or being in a long distance relationship. But yeah, I always say about Roger, he's the middle of 5 boys in 7 years, and he's a redhead. So he's very determined. So, the rest is history. But I moved to New York and worked for a brand new organization at the time called the Fox News Channel, and worked there for 12 years. And It was a startup, truly. I remember my first interview, they said, we're not going after the CNNs of the world. We will crush them in ratings soon enough. We're going after the networks, and we're going to make a difference and kind of disrupt the landscape of media, which has not been disrupted really before. So it was pretty fascinating to watch that evolve, and nobody watched it. My mom didn't even have it on her cable when I first started. So it was an interesting experience, and I got to have a lot of opportunities. And then I retired maybe 2010. Now I can't even remember. I'm so old.
So who was your favorite person to interview?
That's funny. People ask me that a lot, and there were a lot of fun. Yeah, you get to interview presidential candidates and
Yes.
Bono from U2, who was on talking about philanthropy and all that kind of stuff. But I kind of always go back to when I was a street reporter, and I got more joy kind of out of, not that the big interviews aren't important and satisfying, but I got more joy out of doing, I like the everyday person, people who have done extraordinary things kind of.
Do you think a lot about your career? I mean, it was 20 years. And is that how you kind of have blended into what you're doing now, which we can't wait to talk about too? Is it obviously the base of it?
Yeah, so I retired and our daughters were, I think they were 9. You know, it's funny, it just kind of ends one day, right? And I wasn't really of retirement age, but I was ready between Roger's job and having young kids and doing the news job. I know some people can like, quote unquote, do it all and do it all really well. I felt like I was doing kind of an okay job at all 3 of those jobs, being a journalist, being a mother, and being a spouse of a CEO, which comes with a lot of, just responsibilities, I guess, in some way, a lot of time, really, more than anything, and support. And so I just decided that I needed to focus on 2 of those things and do them pretty well. Or do them better. And then as when you're like trained as a journalist, you see a story unfolding in front of you.
You're like on it, right?
Right?
You're like going after it.
Yes. So I felt like I had a 50-yard line seat, and I was watching things unfold, that like the stories that nobody was telling. And was that because they were about women? Maybe nobody thought of it. I don't know. So that's kind of where it started. It is where it started. I just couldn't help myself. And it just seemed like a natural fit. And it's been really fun and a challenge, because sometimes the women most often don't really want to talk about themselves, which is, I hate to say it, that's a female thing too, right? And that's been part of the challenge, is getting people comfortable with the idea of saying, okay, I am a badass and I'd like to talk about it.
Right. And I'll share my story. Yeah, exactly.
So one of the amazing projects you did, and I recently rewatched it, and actually it was very moving. I found myself kind of crying in parts of it, was A Lifetime of Sundays, which is about remarkable NFL women team owners, and the story of 4 of them. And I think 2 are still alive, and they've lived late into their 90s and 100s, which is so amazing. So tell us about that documentary and what you learned from those ladies.
Yeah, that was kind of how it all started. So one day I was watching the NFL Network, and they have a franchise called A Football Life. And there's these great 30-minute like mini docs. And it just occurred to me, I sit next to a woman named Virginia Hallis McCaskey often at events. I am the most fortunate person. She happens to own my team, the Chicago Bears, but her father was George Hallis, who in 1920 was in a car dealership in Canton, Ohio. He owned this little team that ultimately was the Chicago Bears, and with a bunch of other guys started the National Football League. And that's why the Pro Football Hall of Fame is in Canton, Ohio, is because that's where it all started. And that was 1920. She was born in 23. Virginia McCaskey, you sit next to her, and this was at the time we were making the film. She was 95, turning 96, and she could tell you, in 1927 was her first game. The Bears played at Wrigley Field, where the Cubs play back then. She can tell you where she was sitting, her seat number, what her mom was doing, pacing the sidelines. Like her recall is like nothing I have ever experienced. And so I said to Roger, why hasn't there ever been a football life on Virginia? This makes no sense. She's watched literally almost 100 years of football, of the entire history of the league. So the 100th anniversary in 2020 was coming up at the time, and he said, I have no idea. Why don't you call NFL Films? So I didn't know them, but I called up and I just said, people talk a lot about being interested in quote unquote female-based content. How interested are you? Because this seems like a great idea. And they said, 100%. She said yes. And I said, well, I mean, I haven't asked her.
Right.
But we sit together at dinner sometimes. So of course she'll say yes. Well, that, was the beginning of this journey of she said, you're funny. No. My favorite actually anecdote from that process of getting her to yes and getting the women to yes was that I called her son, who's in his 60s, who runs the team, and he said, I'm not asking her, you ask her. So she's a mom of 11, fantastic person, tough taskmaster. So I crafted this really smart email and said, Dear Mrs. McCaskey, this is why this would be so important for the team. And I made it not about her because I knew better, but about her and her family and leaving this gift for your great-grandchildren and all that. And I sent it. And I sent it on a Saturday night in September. And Sunday morning, I got an email back because she loves From Virginia's iPad. She's 95 at the time, right? And I got an email back. Dear Jane, I was surprised to see your email in my inbox on game day.
Oh,
I was like, ooh, she's so intense, right? Doesn't want to speak during the games. I knew that about her. And I'm like, what was I thinking? I've blown it. So it was a good lesson. She said no. I had 4 women on the list. Martha Ford was another choice who owns the Detroit Lions. Her story is equally fascinating. She is a Firestone tire heiress, married Bill Ford of the Ford Motor Company. Their moms set them up. They got married at 19. And when he passed away, he left the team to her. She was 88 years old and took the podium and said, the coach is gone. The GM is gone. I'm tired also of not winning, and I want to win a Super Bowl too. And it's a new era. And you can imagine the reaction and the media reaction and fans. They were like, who is this, older woman telling us this? And she, this year I was so happy to see them have such success in this past season. She was there. I saw her at the playoff games. So I went to Martha and said, what do you think, Mrs. Ford? She said, no, it's not about me. It's about we. I didn't do anything. It was a team effort. So that was like a real moment where I thought, ooh, that's the generation of we, and we're living in this selfie generation of me, right? So then I went and asked Norma Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. I asked Pat Rooney of the Pittsburgh Steelers, all these iconic franchises, these women who are all in their 80s and 90s, and I got 4 no's. So they would probably characterize me as a polite pain in the ass, but I was definitely a pain. I just felt very strongly that we were losing this window to get their stories down. And it was, it's a different perspective and a history of an organization. It's such an American organization. And these are families that started it and owned it and lived it. And it's very rich. Finally, Pat Rooney of the Steelers said, Jane, I feel sorry for you. So, what if we did something together? So they didn't agree to a film, but I put them together on a panel at the NFL annual meeting. And I got a call from Roger the day before the meeting, and he was down there a day early. And he said, what are you doing? You're messing up my owners' meetings. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, your panel tomorrow. All our lead owners are saying, I'm not coming to your meeting, Roger, because I want to go hear who. We titled them the Fab Four, and we had 500 people in the room. You could hear a pin drop. I didn't even need to be there as a moderator because once I set them off, they just went and told stories. There was such respect amongst them and really amazing humor. And the stories they told were the history of the league. So as we got off the stage, Virginia McCaskey came over in her walker and said, I apologize to you. I gave you a hard time and I'll do what you want. And I said, well, how about we make a movie? And she said, email me. So I
but
did.
Not on Sunday.
Not on Sunday, not on game day. And then we were kind of off and running. And, Doro, you said you were crying. That is a very common reaction. And when we screened it the following year at the annual meeting, we had 800 people in the room and we screened it. And there were the number of large men in the room bawling their eyes out, including Roger Goodell. He was supposed to close it after the film ended, and he couldn't do it. So he gave the mic to me and said, I can't stand up there. Because I think it was so much a part of your personal history. That's the thing about football. It's so much about your family, too, or your friends, or who you watch with, or how you learned the game. People were really affected by just the personal stories involved. And, there are highlights, you go over moments that you remember. And it was fun. It was fun to watch the reaction. And then ultimately the women, I think they all were happy. And Pat Rooney said to me at that meeting that we screened it at, she said, you know what? I did not expect this. She said, I've never had this experience. I've been to 56 annual meetings. That's how long she's been in the NFL. And her husband owned the team. And she said, not once has anyone come up to me and said, Pat, tell me about you.
Yeah.
And she didn't say it with any negativity other than she was just really pleasantly surprised at how that 90-minute or 1 hour and 10-minute film caused people to walk up to her and say, I'm fascinated by you. I want to know more. That was like the most powerful moment, I feel like, for me.
Did those 4 women, did they talk to each other very often? And so were they friends?
That's a really good question. So lions, bears
Right.
play each other every Thanksgiving, or that was a tradition for a long time. And so Mrs. McCaskey and Mrs. Ford definitely had this very friendly rivalry. Every year before the game, they would get together to say hi, and then they'd go play each other.
Yeah.
So they knew each other the best. But interestingly, if I remember correctly, I think it was Mrs. Rooney, Mrs. Hunt. There were some who, when they sat down on the stage, said, oh, it's so great to meet you, which is surprising because they'd all been at these meetings all these years, but a few of them hadn't spent time together. And that also made for a fun conversation because they were discovering things and hearing stories for the first time.
What really touched me in the film was, I think it was Mrs. McCaskey who had the very close relationships with players. One with Brian Piccolo, who died of cancer, and Walter Payton, and how after Brian Piccolo died, and it was so hard on their family because she just loved him, that she said, well, I'm not going to get close to any other players. But she couldn't help it with Walter Payton and sort of fell in love with him as well. And then he passed away. And so how all in these women were was what struck me.
You know, at the end of the day, it's a family business, which I think sometimes, you know, we can think of, NFL owners sitting in their fancy suites. And that is all that. They come from great wealth and it's often passed down to their children and all that. But it is a family business, and that involves personal relationships. And back in the day when she started working in this family business, think about that, when she was of age, probably in the 40s, 50s, 60s. It was a different sport also. It wasn't quite as sophisticated and dominant as it is today as an industry. And they did do things with the players and their families and did become very close to them. You know, she always said too, I wasn't supposed to own this team because her father died and left it to her brother. And then her brother died unexpectedly of a heart attack. And so she all of a sudden was thrust into the spotlight. She said it was a job I never wanted, but I had to do it to honor my father. So she would have been happy to kind of stay on the sidelines, so to speak, but she did that because her father, that was his plan and that was what he wanted. You know, it's very emotional for all of them. And the players are so young, right? They come in at 22 years old. They have grandchildren who are older than the players are. So I think they also feel, you know, in some ways like a maternally
Yes.
towards them. It's hard not to.
And Norma Hunt remarkably attended every single Super Bowl.
Was that crazy?
Incredible.
Including, she passed away, unfortunately, last year, but she had not been feeling well before last year's Super Bowl with the Chiefs. And she wanted to keep that streak up. And she flew out that morning. I'm sure her doctors were not happy with her, but she made it. She said, I can't break the streak. And the only women, there are a few men remaining who have seen every single one, but she held the longest streak for a woman. And actually, the majority of the people who were in a group that have seen every Super Bowl, some of them are media, right? So they were there for work, kind of. And then there are a few who are just there for fans. And then she obviously was married to Lamar Hunt as the owner of the Chiefs.
How now afterwards, how has it changed the relationships between the owners? Have these women been able to change things with their stories amongst the NFL, or how has it changed things?
I think it almost has to have. I hope that the film, and I could kind of see that it brought fresh eyes to it, right? And now there are so many more women involved and owners. We have several teams who the husband and wife own it together and run it together, which is something you didn't necessarily see before. And then there are just so many women involved in all levels of the game now, which also is something you didn't see before. And that's a fairly recent phenomenon to see women quickly achieving these positions of, you know, kind of power in the league. So it's a different world. It's been really fun to watch.
We talk a lot about longevity on our podcast, and all of these women just lived incredibly long lives. Do you think having a passion, and in this case, football, contributed to that?
I think you are so right. Virginia is 101. Martha Ford is, I believe, 98. And Norma and Pat passed away very recently. That was one of my questions, really, in the project, was how are they so engaged? They can tell you everything. They were texting their sons or whoever the offspring was running the team, talking about plays. They all are so engaged. You cannot talk to them on game day, right? And I think it was very, very much the passion and engagement. You can't underestimate that. You are attached to something. And we have this great scene in the film where Pat Rooney and the Steelers, they have this big Irish family. And there's this scene where people just keep coming out of the house, heading to the stadium. And there's another one and another one and another one and another one. And, she was the head of that and going to game day. And they all, having that big family, keeping you engaged. And it is their life's work. I also think my big takeaway, too, was laughter. They've all dealt with, as anybody that age has dealt with personal tragedies and such, and certainly ups and downs of owning a football team and being in a community where you lose and people are not nice, and then you raise kids and they're not nice to your kids. It's a lot of turmoil and stress, and they can laugh and make you laugh like nobody's business. So I thought that was a real key too.
Jane, this conversation is amazing, and I think we just scratched the surface. We hope you can join us next week to continue the conversation.
Wow, nice. Okay.
Thank you for joining us on Health Gig. We loved having you with us. We hope you'll tune in again next week. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast and follow us on healthgigpod.com. I'm Tricia.
And I'm Doro.
Be well.